Hi, welcome to Heliotropes. My name's Julia.
And my name's Kwadjo.
And today we're going to be talking about Hamilton, Lin-Manuel Miranda's production that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, at least in name. And some of you have probably seen it. So Kwadjo and I just watched it. And we just finished it today. We started it last weekend, so that'll give you some indication maybe of where this is going. But where would you like to start, Kwadjo? What'd you think?
Well, I do want to say that we're not just talking about Hamilton because we can't express our views. As y'all know, we have a pretty decidedly political orientation with the content that we consume, which isn't to say that we politicize everything. I think it's kind of recognizing that everything is politicized, right? So what are the implications of, the politics in certain things? And so, we're going to be talking about Hamilton as a piece of art, but, in the political domain, it's also a recognition, a broader discussion on, art and the responsibility of artists to society and certain causes and propaganda and what that is and, minority access in a certain sense to certain realms of status and celebrity and recognition and different barriers therein. So hopefully we're going to get to all that. But yeah, as a piece of art, see, that's the thing. I can't even say, because I want to say, it technically, it's a sound production, Daniel was saying. He definitely put a lot of work into it, Lin-Manuel Miranda. It definitely shows, it's not quality-wise, it's not garbage. I guess it's pretty good. But, that's where the politics comes in. Is this could have been... Anyway, what did you think?
Well, I guess I would agree with you on the production piece. I'm not huge into musicals, so it was a bit of a struggle at points. And it was just too difficult for me to pull apart the production from what was being said and going on.
The propaganda.
So, yeah. So, I don't ever care to see it again.
Yeah.
And honestly, I was ready to stop watching it about 4.5 minutes in, but, Kwadjo persists through those films and TV programs. So,
and in this one, we persevered for the sake of podcasting.
Yeah,
it's good to have an objective at the end, of the thing. Yeah, it was hard to watch.
From the jump. One of the first songs I think was about we're so lucky to be alive in the greatest city in the world.
Yeah.
So curious what your take is on that.
New York?
Yeah.
At the time?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's just very... So, the big thing, right? As far as the notes that I took, the very first note, and I don't know why I hadn't really thought of this before, right? Because when Hamilton came into vogue, when it was, when it debuted and, it was sensational... Right, we didn't hear anything new, before we watched it. It was just the opportunity came up to watch it, and so we watched it. And, I remembered going back, I was working with elementary school kids, 4th and 5th graders when it came out. So they were really into it, and they were singing, and they're like, oh, you want to hear this rap, blah, blah, blah. I have some funny stories, but not for here. And so it appealed to, the youth, the hip hop sense. People were like, oh, it's such a diverse cast, blah, blah, blah. People were like, oh, Alexander Hamilton, what a great story, what a great person, blah, blah, blah. And I didn't really think anything of it until, we sat down and, in those first 4, under 5 minutes, listening to what they were saying, greatest city on earth, cosplaying. So, that's the very first note I wrote is, it's people of color cosplaying as the founding fathers, AKA, the wealthy, anyway. The point there is that, from the start, it's a really uncomfortable watch if you, one of the things, the running themes in our, critique is this whole idea of diversity and inclusion. It's to why would anyone, and I guess we can get into the why later because I do have my sense of why, but it just didn't seem worth celebrating. You know, it didn't seem worth the accolades if we're actually critically looking at who these characters are representing, right? Like, it's just one of those really weird things. Like, yeah, you can grow up to be anything you want, especially if you're an actor, you know, trying to be on Broadway. But, you know, like, to what extent should any person aspire to represent, you know, like, wealthy white slave owners in any good light? And I literally, you know, at the very least, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison were slaveholders, you know. I'm not saying every character in, you know, the story of Alexander Hamilton was a slave owner, but those three were. And they all played, you know, figured very prominently in, you know, like, as they do in American history, in Hamilton. So it's just kind of like, right, there you go in. Like, yeah, as an artist, you know, Lin-Manuel LMM can be like, yo, yeah, like I want to portray these characters in a positive light and tell their story. But I think there's a question of, you know, social responsibility as to how one does that, and did he go about it the right way,
and why?
Yeah.
Like, because it's not like there's stories that have been tainted or haven't already been told in a positive light in terms of, like, mainstream media and U.S. education, you know, and, like, I also, I mean, I wonder why did anybody want to play them? And I also wonder, like, why, you know, as you were talking about that, I just kept thinking about this line that was really jarring to me about Sally Hemings and Jefferson and him being like, hey, Sally, bring me that note or something he was singing.
Be a deer.
Yeah, and then thinking, like, why would somebody want to play her in an art production without any critical analysis, given how her story is taught in U.S. history, which is that she and Thomas Jefferson had children together and were like, had, you know, some romantic relationship instead of the fact that he owned her and raped her. So yeah, it was, I mean, the idea that, like, I want to tell the Founding Fathers story in a positive light while erasing indigenous folks, I don't know, it's weird and I don't get it. And I was really hoping, you know, like you said, there wasn't anything else we had heard before. Like, we just got access to watch it.
Yeah.
And I was hoping that I was missing something. Because, like, some people in my life are like, this is so good. And they're not white. And so, like, I was really hoping, you know, that I was, like, missing something. And I wasn't.
No.
And,
Yeah.
I mean, and I took 4 notes. Because it was just a lot. Yeah.
That took a little more than 4.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, I mean, you know, like, to the question of why someone would do this, that was a major, like, recurring refrain in the story is, quote, if they tell my story, right? So apparently, you know, Lin-Manuel Miranda got the idea for this after he finished reading the autobiography of Alexander Hamilton. He was like, what a great story, you
Not
know,
an
like...
autobiography.
Or a biography?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Someone else telling Alexander Hamilton's story. And he was like, oh, this is great. Like, let's, you know, and then the rest is history. If they tell my story, and, you know, to your point, like, one, how many times, right? Like, clearly the story's already been told. 2, you know, they said something at the end, like, oh, you know, all the other founding fathers get their story told. I mean, this guy's on, what, the $10 bill? Which one of them? Yeah, he's on money.
Yeah.
You know? Like, we know that I learned about him in school. Like, I learned this story in school. Right? I think about all the things you don't learn in school. Mm-hmm. This was one of the things that I did learn in school.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure I learned about him in school too. I don't remember, but that's not because of that. I learned about him from somebody who learned about him in school. Shout out to Katie, and that's how I remember. And she did it appropriately.
Yeah. Nice. Good job, Katie. Get it. Yeah. And then, like, you know, your other point, I mean, I guess it's the same point, but it's also like, not only are their stories not being told, but who's going out there, like, telling the wrong story, you know, like, no one's out there bashing the founding fathers, at least in any way that gets press, you know. So it's not like, oh, I'm going to show them in the light they deserve to be shown in, right? Everyone's showing them in the same light, right? It's the myth of America, founding father propaganda type deal. Like, this falls into that exact same category. So there really is nothing new to this story except for what it brings to Broadway, right? Which is this whole idea of hip hop and diverse casting. Like this is the most diverse cast ever, you know, or something like that on Broadway as far as musicals and plays.
Can I return to the previous point too, just for a moment? Like the idea of telling the story, because like you brought up social responsibility before, you know, and like one of the things that this does, that I felt this did, was make the founding fathers like more relatable and like more fun and humanizing them. And I mean, we've talked about this before, that that's important. And at the same time, like, what are you doing? Yeah. You know, like, what is the end goal of doing that in this scenario? Because that to me is really, I mean, it just feels socially irresponsible to be like, look, like, they're super fun and they like rap and, you know, have romance and love stories and they're funny and they're likable, et cetera, et cetera. Like the world has moved on, you know, like, and so it's just like, what's in the way of like, there's other stories to tell, right. You know, it's like, don't come at this with like okay, and I guess this is maybe where this intersects with the Broadway piece for me, of this like social justice, like breaking barriers thing, and we'll talk more about that. But like coming at it from that perspective while being like, so I'm going to share this story and try and humanize and make these people more relatable in the sense of propaganda. Like it feels like this high level marketing, gross psychology thing to me in some ways.
And it definitely is. It definitely is. And I wonder if in part, like, that didn't also factor into... All right, so, like, I mean, there's a few things. One of the things that I guess that I wanted to comment on is, like, you know, again, on the issue of, like, why would he do this? Or...
Why did you do this?
Yeah, not so much like that, but you know, like his motives. You know, 'cause we were talking to one of Julia's friends earlier. You know, shout out Daniel. And I mean, he's watched a lot of the content around this, and you know, Lin-Manuel Miranda interviews and stuff that last longer than the actual play. So you know, big up with that patience. But you know, like, he was like, you know, I'm sure, like, he doesn't know, you know, Lin-Manuel Miranda doesn't understand, like, kind of, like, the social implications of, you know, like, putting this kind of content out there, this kind of propaganda. Which I thought was a really interesting point, because I literally wrote, yeah, where is it? There's this, I wrote, quote, question of artistic responsibility to historical narrative, to justice, to society, etc. And I can't find it right here, but at some point along the way, I was like, why would he write this? Oh, okay. Why would he be so inspired to write a play based on this figure? And the reason I asked that question is because, yeah, like, on the one hand, let's say he has no, you know, he literally reads the story, and at some point he's like, you know, as innocently and sincerely as possible, I'm going to tell this story with, like, the most diverse cast to ever hit Broadway. And, like, I'm going to pour my all into it, and it's going to be a hit, right? That's the optimistic, the idealistic view. And, you know, none of the social issues or, you know, propaganda pieces factor into that. My view, immediately upon seeing this, or at least thinking that thought, this question of why would he do it, is he knew it. You know, like, he knows. And, you know, Daniel also brought up a really good point about, like, the difficult, right, like we were talking about earlier, the barriers to entry to, like, status and success in certain fields and stuff. And, like if he was going to be successful with this type of deal, this was the way to do it, right? Mm-hmm. Like, in a sense, this is the best possible production that he could have done in this way, right? So the accolades make sense in that sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, he also brought up the fact that Lin-Manuel Miranda's white,
Yeah.
right? And so, like, and I mean, there's probably, I don't know what the conversation is around that, but I think that cannot be removed from this part of the conversation or from the cast in general and the colorism on display.
Yeah. Yeah. Which are, I mean, those are things we can. Anyway, yeah. So, just to close out that thought, it's very possible that he could have very well known that, like, what he was doing. He could have known essentially that he's whitewashing this story through the use of, I mean, not even, right? Because is it whitewashing if you take, like, a whitewashed version of history and then put a woke, diverse cast on top of it? Or are you just diversifying whitewashed history, Anyway, I think it's very possible that he could have been aware of these conflicts. As an artist, I empathize with him. Like, yeah, tough questions. You want to be successful, you want to be, right, like if you're ambitious in that sense, and clearly he was, but also, anyway, history is made up of these questions. It's options, choices.
Yeah. I'm really intrigued by one of your notes that I glanced down and saw about the song Raise a Glass to Freedom, something they can never take away, and your subsequent note, the fuck?
Yeah. Yeah. Like, this is one of those, who was it? Lafayette was singing this.
They were all singing it, weren't they?
Well, I mean, like, as far as the specific characters. Because it was like the three, Lafayette, Hamilton, and...
Madison.
No, Madison wasn't in there yet. Madison wasn't in the first half. He came after the intermission.
Was Burr there at that point?
Yes, but Burr
was
wasn't
he
in
friends with them?
It was the guy who was playing the fool.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember who that character was. But it's the same character who played Madison. The same actor who played Madison. Yeah, and like, I mean, the point here, this is emblematic of one of the really uncomfortable things about the whole thing is like, and I guess it wasn't super uncomfortable because once you expect it, you kind of like, that the comfort comes in. Like, it's not comforting, but it's not uncomfortable anymore. It's just a point of contention. Is that this idea of raising a glass to freedom, right? They're fighting for the revolution. So there's, in a sense, right, because if you take this stuff out of time, if you don't look at it critically, like through a critical historical lens, then that whole first half where they're talking about the revolution kind of factors into, justifications of modern day, like war, propaganda. Right? Like, we're going to fight this war for freedom. Like, there wasn't really, which gets also into the whole other thing about, like, you can argue that, like, if you look at the lines that the characters were saying, there are cogent lines of argument for, like, taken, from the historical context to justify, like, what was going on. But because of the delivery modes, which is, something else we could get into, something Julia brought up while we were watching it, like, it's reasonable to expect that a lot of the audience didn't understand a lot of what was going on, like, in detail. You get the broad strokes, and then I also wonder how much of that was deliberate, and I have that somewhere in here as well.
Yeah. Isn't that a nice parallel to how the U.S. government operates?
Right, yeah. Like, constipated language that, like, dense, academic, overly academic, that,
I mean, it's inaccessible.
Yeah.
And then the stuff that is accessible as they're like meaningless slogans.
Yeah.
Like raising the $15, raising the minimum wage and the $2,000 checks.
Exactly. Extra meaningless when you don't do it. But yeah, I mean, the Raise a Glass of Freedom piece, I mean, it also touched on, right? Because in that line, you have Lafayette. I don't remember in history if he was a black man. I'm pretty sure he was. Yeah, one of the heroes of the Haitian Revolution as well. And it's a really funny painting of him, but I think it's only funny today. Not going into it, though. Like, him singing that, like, his character, or the character, the figure being a black man, an African man, singing with Alexander Hamilton, this white man, and like another white person about raising a glass to freedom, knowing that like an incentive, and the 1619 Project also played into my thoughts on this movie. That's why I asked like when it was, because apparently, right, you told me that it came out in like 2016 or something, and
the movie,
the play, like when people were
did it
talking about it.
It came out before then.
Okay, then maybe the movie did. I don't know when you told me. I don't actually remember you telling me, so maybe you didn't tell me that. But the point is, it came out. It wasn't as recent as I thought it was. Because in my head it came like this happened right before the 1619 Project became a big deal, which is not exactly how it is. But right, that's something to think about. Anyway, you have Lafayette, like being like. Anyway, point is, slavery was a big part of this whole revolution deal, right? Like, at the very least, and, I get a lot of people are like, yeah, slavery was a part of it, but the revolution was more important, but this kind of goes into what we were talking about on Sunday with, like, one of the things that we have to really be, keep in mind is that, yes, these people were brilliant, right? They were brilliant statesmen, they were brilliant, authors, they were brilliant at expressing their ideas, and, one of the things you mentioned is, like, yeah, they had the time to do that shit, and like, that's how class
that
worked
fucking
back
song.
then. Yeah. But, and so, like, yeah, like, they were really, that stuff is admirable. They had really great ideas. But their ideologies and their worldviews were clearly shaped by, like, like, racism, right? They were clearly shaped by slavery, to the point that people were willing to let, like, this whole anti-human, like, sentiment slide, right? And my issue there is that I understand when a lot of people will come up and be like, yeah, well, like, it's about Alexander Hamilton, right? Like, you can't make it about slavery. There's no room for, like, all of this critical analysis on slavery and, like, race. I get that argument. But, right, then, again, you have to think about the damage that does, right? Like, what do we need in this day and age? Do we need another story? Again, we need to tell a story from beginning to end. That was the refrain. Which one do we need more, right? Another positive story about Alexander Hamilton or any founding father, or critical analysis of like race, like, and it doesn't have to be about slavery specifically. It can be about race, right? And feature slavery, right? But, that all gets into the idea of telling a different story, which, as Daniel mentioned, wouldn't have got this much. Like, if it was the different story that it needed to be, it's reasonable to assume it wouldn't have gotten the accolades that it did, the coverage that it did.
Mm-hmm.
So
I find that argument annoying. The one about, like, it's about Alexander Hamilton, so there can't be all this room for critical analysis about race, because Alexander Hamilton is not devoid of race or his role in slavery, or, like, erasing indigenous cultures.
Right.
And especially given how Hamilton was created and marketed, right? Like, using rap and hip-hop and other forms of music that I don't know because I don't know music, and maybe all, or like almost all Black and brown cast. So, like, but yeah, we can do those things, but please don't ask us for a critical examination of race here while we're trying to break into Broadway, and this is maybe the only way that we can do it, by telling this story.
Right. And that whole, like, idea of breaking into Broadway with this story, right? Because when people talk about the actors who are in there, like, I get it. Like, if you're an actor looking for an opportunity, this was, like, for all the people who are in there, like, a big opportunity, the big opportunity, probably, possibly of their careers, And again, right, going to Lin-Manuel Miranda himself, like, same deal. If you're a playwright, and you're struck with this idea, then boom, that's it. Yeah, it's A lot of gray areas.
Yeah, I mean, the freedom song is ironic. That's how we started this part, right? Like, for so many reasons. I mean, some of which we just outlined, but I cannot stress this enough. The indigenous erasure in this musical production is, I mean, what the fuck? Like, that's a basic, yeah, I mean, especially because of how it was like billed and as this breakthrough and all this stuff and just this continued, like, and I guess that's part of the whole thing, right? Just this replaying of this story that we all know in this country, even, you know, like not in this country, like Daniel probably knows more U.S. history than I do, but like, you know, just this retelling of these stories that just continue to erase people and cultures.
And that was something, I mean, on the Raise a Glass to Freedom thing, one of the other things I was going to mention is that falling in line with, like, short of the critical analysis of race and slavery, the way they covered it was also very, I mean, it was very neoliberal, right? Very superficial. I mean, we could count. I started counting, and I think in the first act there were like 2 overt, you know, like, references to slavery where people were like, oh, and then we're going to free all the slaves, you know? And then they were like, oh, you know, like, you know, he used to be a slave. And then in like the second act, there was like 1, again, maybe 2 overt references. Like, if he was alive, he would have wanted to free the slaves. We have so much work to do. You know, like that's what he would have been doing.
Or about freeing 3,000 enslaved men so they can fight in the war.
Yeah, create the first,
Oh my gosh.
And that was, I don't even think he said freeing 3,000 enslaved men, did he? I think he was just saying, like, we're just going to assemble, like, a group of 3,000, like, black men to create the first, but maybe.
I think it was freeing them to do that.
Okay. So, like, in that context, right, if we take this issue of slavery, right, one of the 2 original sins of this country, then we have a superficial analysis, right? Bless you.
Thanks.
And, you know, again, in the same way that, like, so much of the dialogue is really inaccessible, right, it is really, like, you have to pay attention that much more to not only the stuff that's inaccessible, but the stuff that you can understand, right? So the fact that we can point even those examples out means they're like, okay, like, it's some sort of justification. They're like, hey, you know, like, we mentioned slavery, and every time it's a prop, right? So that's the thing. Slavery, anytime it factored into the story, it factored in as a prop. And possibly even, you know, less than a prop. It was just like, hey, you know, audience, we didn't forget that slavery was still a thing, you know, even though we're not going to do anything about it. So, like, to the point that you're bringing up about indigenous erasure, like, that being, you know, like, the original sin of this country, it is really jarring that there is no mention, or at least no discernible mention, of indigenous folks, which probably, you know, like, I don't know, like, I don't recall in any first-hand documents how any of the founding fathers actually spoke about enslaved people, enslaved Africans. But for sure, like, if you read their writings on how they spoke about, like, you know, indigenous people, it's obviously very racist, you know, and it pretty much goes along the lines of, you know, like, some of them are Christian now, which is cool, you know, like, maybe they can eventually get to where we are, we can work with them. And then also, you know, they're savages, you know, and, like, we need that land, you know, and I think an interesting point, you know, just this kind of a tangent, but, you know, 1619 Project, you know, was coming under fire because, by the right, you know, because people were like, oh, you know, they're saying that slavery was a major reason we went to war and stuff like that. It is important to know, and this is something I want to look into more, but, like, in 1772, I believe, an English court case, like common law court case, resulted in the end of slave trade, you know, or England's participation in slave trade, right? Which I think in America it was 1809 or 1814. So the fact...
What do you mean by England's involvement? Because weren't they benefiting financially for
Right.
decades
So
after that? You mean
they
that they outlawed
outlawed
slavery?
no, I think it's slave trade.
Okay,
Because there was no slavery in England.
but not participation in it, because they were still participating in it in the United States by providing like bonds and whatever.
Right, they were participating via their colonies, and I think that was like one of the major concerns of the founding fathers is that, oh, you know, like if slave trade is outlawed, you know, by England proper, and we're over here making like buku money, you know, with the slave trade, right? It's one of those things, and King George III is portrayed as this like great villain, which I'm not going to argue. You know,
He was that was my favorite character.
yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say the same, but I didn't like any of them.
Well, yeah, but you weren't supposed to like him, and he didn't make you like him.
Yeah, true.
Right? Like, he was the only one
was
who
the
I
most
was kind of
authentic.
like, yeah, good. He seems like a dick, and he's acting like one.
Yeah,
That's fine.
yeah. So, I mean, I think that's something that's important to keep in mind too. Just like in a historical sense, that has less to do with the play, but just like, you know, keep in mind that like that is evidence that the colonies in the States, 13 colonies, did have that incentive to go to war, especially considering how much, right? Because that was one of the things that Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, right, in that like second act, you know, debate had, like, oh, you know, Thomas Jefferson, you have, right, that was another one of them.
Yeah.
Aren't you a slave owner, Thomas Jefferson? Not that I'm going to, like, say anything about it, you know, like, literally, anyway. But, like, the point there, you know, Jefferson's point there was, like, we're over here, like, actually making things, you know, like, producing goods to sell, right? We're producing value. And, you know, Alexander Hamilton, you're just trying to, like, you know, piggyback off of the value that we're producing, blah, blah, blah. So, like, again, like, slavery is mentioned in passing as a prop, but, like, with the underlying historical analysis being that, you know, like, the economy of the States, even back then, was really heavily dependent on slave labor and, like, specifically, you know, the slave labor in the Southern economy. I don't remember where I started with that. But.
Well, we were talking about the erasure of indigenous cultures,
yes.
and
Yeah.
I mean, you just to kind of like bring it back around, you know, that slavery is mentioned as a prop basically throughout, is what you're saying.
Right.
And indigenous cultures were not even mentioned at all.
Yeah, not even as a prop.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
that's damning. But, like, you know, I think the question, like, my point with the first-hand anecdotes there is, like, how is it possible to tell this story in that propagandistic sense and include, you know, the indigenous people, right? The First Nations people. You could argue that anything's possible, but also you could argue that it's not possible, right? So, like, the omission of their story is a condemnation on, like, the need of, like, the impetus to tell this story, right? Like, if you have to leave out, like, narratives like that in order to tell the story in a way that people are going to like, you probably shouldn't tell the story, you know? Or you should tell the story honestly. But, you know, again, people might not like it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What do you want to go to next? I feel like there's, you know, colorism, sexism.
Before I forget, just because I didn't write it down, Alexander Hamilton, you know, father of the, you know, American Treasury, you know, the Federal Reserve. I don't know the history very well, but the Federal Reserve, like, in the play, in, you know, Hamilton, one of the big strikes against him that I don't think they made this very clear at all was that, like, he was trying to consolidate power through finances. And it's just important to note that, like, and maybe it was because he died, but, like, he started the Federal Reserve, essentially. Or at least America's first central bank. And then the central bank failed. And it failed for, like, 100 years until, like, 1913, when the Federal Reserve Bank was started back up, presumably to, like, stabilize the economy. And you can argue, you know, back and forth as to how well that happened or whether it was needed. But I think a lot of the critiques against the Federal Reserve now are valid. One, right? Like, it's a private institution that, like, charges America interest and, like, is able to produce, like, print as much money as it wants, blah, 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 or as it sees fit, and then, like, reap the rewards, right? So there's a relatively unaccountable, super powerful third party, right? It's everything like what they were saying in the thing against Alexander Hamilton. It came true. So like the fact that he kind of like authored that kind of institution to hold this kind of like clandestine economic central authority over the United States right after leaving like the central economic and social and like moral and religious authority of King George, in the Revolution. That's something. It's something to note. Yeah, but we can go to. Next. Yeah, I also wrote that too. Greatest city in the world. Mm-hmm. People of color singing about the Revolution as it's happening in the greatest city in the world. Mm-hmm. So, there's the colorism piece, which I think is kind of like, I don't know. Anyway, you go ahead. You go first. I'm still organizing my thoughts.
About the colorism piece?
Yeah.
Well, now I'm very curious what your thoughts are. That part, the colorism on stage is very clear. And, like, I don't really know what else to say about it. It's pretty blatant. Burr is the narrator and is portrayed as the villain. And he's dark-skinned. And then the actor who plays James Madison in the second half and in the first half plays like kind of like the sidekick fool of the little like trio there. I don't really have a whole lot of thoughts on it other than like it fits pretty much what like colorism to a T, including with the women.
Yeah.
I don't have like in-depth analysis. It's pretty clear.
Colorism in casting is, I think there's, so like one of the things I think is interesting is the question of colorism in this kind of like scenario where like we're also questioning the extent to which diversity in casting is even a thing.
Yeah.
Like if part of my argument implicitly, I'm not saying that like this should be the thing, but it's kind of implied in our approach to Hamilton is like white oligarchical racist characters should not be portrayed by people of color for the sake of diversity and inclusion. Then how does that shift the colorism thing, right? Because like if it was a different story with like different characters, but like the same archetypes and everything and the same actors in those roles, like for sure the colorism thing would be it would be easier to approach, I think, as far as a critique. That's the main thing. I had something else that I was working on, but then I thought of that, and that kind of like, yeah. But otherwise, there's a lot of textbook, like Lin-Manuel Miranda, the main character, playing, super light-skinned, white passing dude, playing the white man, like his wife being the white woman.
And not just his wife being the white woman, but the sister, his wife's sister.
Angelica?
Yeah. Being darker skinned, and then the woman who he had an affair with also being darker skinned than his wife.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And so like, and Angelica is portrayed, if you haven't seen Hamilton, and I don't know how much of this is accurate. Yeah.
For the whole
She's
thing.
into him, right? She's into Hamilton. And they have some like, I don't know, there doesn't seem like there's an affair of any kind, but they definitely have some sort of connection that it seems like they're hiding from Eliza, his wife. And then there's the woman that he has an affair with, who her husband, who knows about the whole thing, is light-skinned.
Right.
And like almost white passing, I think I would say.
Yeah, I thought he was a white man.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
until,
you know,
yeah.
I mean, it certainly, yeah.
And then also, sorry, go ahead.
No, if you were going to stay on that topic before.
I thought, it was the character of Lin-Manuel Miranda, like the contrast between Aaron Burr and, Hamilton. Burr being like, anyway, like kind of like loud and braggadocious and like, really forthcoming with the ladies, and also being like the dark-skinned black man. And then like to contrast that, like Hamilton being like this, what I wrote, meek, light-skinned, white-passing protagonist. So, not super scathing, but, the point is that there's that contrast. And, here's one of the other things, right? From an artistic standpoint, it makes sense to have foils like that kind of casting makes sense in a foil sense, right? Like, it makes sense to, like, when you're thinking about stage presence and stuff, right? Like the way people stand, the way people look, it can help differentiate like different roles, like bring out different roles better. So I was kind of, sympathetic to that. And then one of the things I was also wondering is like, to what extent is there like that argument for colorism if the roles are reversed? Like if Lin-Manuel Miranda, or right, if Aaron Burr was played by like a light-skinned dude, well, I don't know. I guess I don't really understand, like, light skin colorism character roles that well. I don't know if that's what it is. But, like, like reverse that's one of my approaches to colorism is, like, right, sometimes, like, it's definitely a thing, and possibly all the time it's definitely a thing. But, like, in casting, if you reverse the roles, to what extent am I still going to be able to see colorism, just like in a different sense,
Yeah, I mean, I think part of that is like who gets the main roles, right? And even though Aaron Burr is on stage quite a bit and is narrating what's going on and has a major role, like are people remembering him or Daveed Diggs, Thomas Jefferson, right? Like remembering him more or remembering Hamilton more, right? So it's like who's getting the main roles that are people are going to be remembering and talking about.
Right. King George, the drooling, self-absorbed tyrant, is the only character faithful to history and a sense of justice. Okay, and I think that's an artistic sense of justice, as in like, it makes sense to portray him as like a drooling tyrant. Like that was a nice touch, the drool. Neoliberalism on Broadway, literally take like everything wrong with the founding story narrative of America, and superimpose diversity and inclusion on it. So actually, this is a good way to go too. Like as far as like that diversity and inclusion argument is, like, are there people and comment if this is you who saw this and you were like, this is how it should be, like this is how stories should be told, right? Like we should just have more diversity everywhere, right? Because for me it reminds me literally, again going back to like the opportunity to build this thing, like for Lin-Manuel Miranda, and the opportunity to participate in this thing for everyone who got a job like on stage through this thing is like this aspirational quality of the neoliberal agenda and like diversity and inclusion in this day and age, right? It's uncritical and aspirational in the sense that that's what equality, like it's the like whether it really doesn't matter what your stance on early American history is, or the people, like you could love them, you could hate them, the founding fathers, but they were oppressors as well, like yes, they were being oppressed by King George in England, but also they, as wealthy white men, and this kind of gets into the last podcast. If you haven't seen it, check it out. But it's on race, and one of the things I was thinking about as far as active and passive white identity is, well, today those two things might exist with like a larger majority of, white people holding, consistent passive white identity because it's not cool to be white anymore. Back then, like definitely back then, and again, this is a thing. If you read their writings, and it's implied in their writings about enslaved Africans, it's implied in their writings about indigenous people in the New World. Their identity was actively white. That is like and not just theirs, but like everyone, right? Like if you were a white person, you were a white person who knew that you were a white person, and like that actively shaped your worldview and your actions. So, like this is the image of like aspiring to the oppressor, right? Which is where the whole issue of the story comes in. It's like, yes, it's cool that hip hop and rap and like all of these traditional African American art forms have been brought to the Broadway stage and made palatable through this play, but at what price? Like fuck it if I'm gonna watch like if I'm gonna see Tupac's like anyone's rhythm and flow and possibly even rhymes and verse come to the stage at the price of being a vehicle for like uncritical jingoistic American propaganda. Like that's not cool. Revisionist history, that's not cool. Like put it on the stage but tell it how it is. Like that's being faithful to the art forms themselves, right? It's not only right, like if you have to compromise the art form in order to get exposure in a certain area, you're not doing any good to the art form. And you're not doing that for the sake of the art form. You're doing it for the sake of yourself, right? So that's the message to Lin-Manuel Miranda, is that like you didn't do hip hop any favors, right? Like you did yourself a favor. And I guess, everyone who you brought up on that stage with you, but
yeah, some of it was pretty cringy. And I think, that's one of the most kind of disappointing pieces about the whole production is that people are complex and society is complex. And in a way where I think it also kind of toes the line between being pretty simple. But there's this understanding or this belief, I feel like, when stories are told, especially by the media, that people can only hold on to one thing at a time, right? Like ignoring. So that's why, like, right, like all this glorification, that people who are watching it can only take that much in. When in reality, like people can understand that somebody can be oppressed and be the oppressor, right? And it's not doing anybody any favors to continue to pretend that people are just one-dimensional and only exist on one plane. That's just not ever how the world works.
right. And that kind of gets into like this question of, and not that I'm going to ask you, but you don't have to have like an answer prepared because this is definitely something that I would need to think on. But I mean, like, what are, right? Because what you're saying kind of gets into like, how do you tell the message, right? Because yes, people are receptive to nuanced realities, but I mean, we understand that a huge part of the reason, or we understand that people are receptive to those things, and we also understand that media that does otherwise is hugely popular. Like this, it's easy to imagine, at least, being hugely popular versus a more critical, cousin of this production. So, like, what qualities, does, like, a production need to have in order to be receptive in its full, nuanced, critical glory? Like, what do you think?
I mean, truth would be a good place to start, I think. And I mean, I don't have thoughts formed around this yet, but one of the things that I'm thinking about is the discomfort that so many people have about telling the truth of what happened hundreds of years ago, despite knowing what actually happened, right? Because then there's this question of like, well, what's so damning about sharing, like what actually went on, and like why are we dancing around it? And I saw something. Okay, this is taking me like away a little bit, but I saw something on Twitter, and it was a thread about like cultural communication. And I'll have to try and find it. But basically it was saying how like white people dance around things and like feel uncomfortable talking about like race and racism and whiteness and things that are like sensitive or difficult conversations. And that black people, and obviously this is like super generalized, but are basically just like pretty direct about what's going on and don't try and dance around it. And so I think about that, like, what is the harm in sharing Hamilton's story for everything that it's worth, right? And like everything that happened, like it's already happened, it's not like people know, people can do research on it and look it up. And so I think like truth and a willingness to and to share that truth is a good place to start. I don't know like what the other pieces would be.
So what's a story that you think would be better?
About him?
I mean, either about him or like in general, right? Like, because personally, I think his story would be a hard one to tell with the kind of, like, if I wanted to tell a meaningful story, I wouldn't tell his story. Meaningful in the way that we're talking about. As far as like larger social analysis, historical, analysis and stuff.
I'm not quite sure what you're asking, like whose story would be better to tell?
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be like one of the founding fathers. Like it could be anyone. Just like if you were Lin-Manuel Miranda and you were reading a biography, like whose biography would you be reading that you're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to make a play about this? Because people need to know this story.
Malala, Asada, Sojourner Truth, Malcolm X. I mean, like, I don't like, but here's like one of the other pieces around that, right? Like, those will never get made right now because of the timeline. And that's part of what I'm saying. Like, this shit with Alexander Hamilton happened 250 plus years ago.
That sounds right.
250-ish years ago. It's over. Like, it's not it's different than because the political circumstances, because people believe the political circumstances are different, there's less of like an emotional reaction to it than there would be around like telling Malala's story, because we all know what the fuck that would look like. Or telling like Malcolm X's story or Asada's Shakur's story. You know what I mean? Like, it would be different. And that's one of the things that I don't get why they can't like tell him in all of his complexity. Like, I'm probably still going to think he's a dipshit, but at least it would be a little bit more real and honest and would match people's experiences. And so, like, for me, it's any story where there's a human element to it, which is the complexity and, like, navigating things. And sorry, but, like, navigating that you cheated on your partner and had an affair and then told the whole world about it for your own benefit and fucked over your partner and your kids is not, like, the complexity I'm talking about. A little bit more insight there. So yeah, we didn't touch on the sexism, and we probably won't, but maybe we can wrap it up in the next couple minutes with your thoughts on the question you just shared.
Well, I have more thoughts on like other stuff, but I mean we've gotten to a lot of it. Oh no, this is something I definitely want to talk about. I'll get to that in a bit. But I mean, like, I agree with you pretty much. Like, I think all of those would have made great stories. And, for the budding future playwrights out there in the future where people are, like, hundreds or thousands of people are watching this video, and there's a budding playwright out there. I mean, any of those people that Julia just mentioned would be great people to do something on. And then also, like, you know, like Geronimo or, right, like Pocahontas, I think, Sacagawea. That would be a really interesting play, right, to tell honestly, you know, because, like, it deviates so much from the narrative, the historical narrative. It would have to deviate so much from the historical narrative in order to tell honestly. And that would be a really, it would paint a really damning portrait of, like, you know, this kind of, like, early explorer American energy that was kind of going on at literally the same time, you know, under Thomas Jefferson.
I mean, even, like, Alexander Hamilton's story would have been much more interesting if it was truthful.
I am curious as to what truths.
I mean, like, a more elaborate understanding of his role in slavery and his, like, talking about wanting to, like, work for abolition and, like, what that, like, looked like and how it didn't happen. Just some more something other than the, like, oh yeah, yay America, woo, yay I'm sexist, woo, like, cool. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah. I mean, I think that's interesting because I actually think that, like, given how much time he spent, right, like, writing the Federalist Papers, you know, putting into the Constitution and drafting this system, I think this play, like, a more truthful version of the, like, and this isn't my understanding. I don't know, you know, I haven't read the autobiography of Alex or the biography, any biographies of him, but I suspect that, like, this play did more to make him seem like he cared more about that stuff than he actually could have in real life.
And I should have clarified because, like, what I meant about that was, like, what he actually did and then what happened, because that gives us a better picture about what was actually going on then and why our country is in the place that it's in right now.
Right.
So I don't mean in the way of, like, framing him in good light. I mean, like, a real telling about, like, what was real and what wasn't real and what happened and what didn't happen and why.
I agree.
Yes, I'll just read a history book instead of turning to Broadway for that.
Yeah, and even then you have to be choosy about who wrote that book. So, you know, like, a few more notes here, but, like, we'll wrap it up. One thing I wrote in here that I thought was interesting, and it goes back to the indigenous piece, you know, because I also thought about that. I don't know if y'all are familiar with Black Hammer organization, but they're, I don't know if they're, like, Marxist-Leninist or whatever, but they're, you know, radical, and, you know, their slogan is land back, you know, and it's like, you know, like, this is indigenous land, so, like, the struggle needs to involve, prioritize, you know, communalism, collective action, and, you know, getting the indigenous people their land back. So that's their whole thing, is, like, land back. That's their greeting and everything. And there's this conversation from Lafayette to Washington where one of them says, "You want to fight for your land back?" And when I heard that, I thought about that, and I was like, this is what I wrote is, you know, this is one of the only audible lines Lafayette utters in this verse, which I thought was interesting because, like, the whole idea there is, like, they're losing the war, right, at this point in time, or it feels like they're losing the war, and things are really dire, and, you know, George Washington's this mighty general, and Lafayette's like, hey, you know, like, you know, buck up, Bucky, you know, like, do you want to get your land back, you know, because the British are taking your land. And I was like, yeah, like, this is not their land, you know, and it's just one of those things to punctuate the erasure, right? Indigenous erasure and co-optation, literally, of indigenous land. And then it was followed a few minutes later with crowd-pleasing immigrants get the job done moment between Alexander Hamilton and Lafayette. So again, you have that superficial, like, out of historical context, oh, yay, immigrants.
And they're both immigrants.
Right.
Right.
But, like, at the time, you know, like, an immigrant was like...
No, I mean the actors.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I suppose. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think Daveed Diggs is... I think neither of them are American-born.
Boom. All right, there you go.
I'm not positive on that, but...
And then, I mean...
Yeah, that was real cringeworthy.
Yeah. Yeah, it was one of those moments.
I mean, that's like Mitt Romney saying that.
And I think that's like the thing is that, I mean, like you said, an authentic telling of his story would have been more, at least more honest and more elucidating, right? Like on like some valuable truths and insights into everything that went into, this American narrative. But like what gets me about these moments, right? Oh, immigrants, yay. Oh, like indigenous erasure, or like rather, American nationalism, like land back. And then like the slavery thing is that they feel like they're outside of the story. It feels like these lines are inserted into the dialogue for the audience, right, to cover their base, like to be like, oh.
Watching that, you should want to tell them all to fuck off.
Yeah.
But really, you're like, yay, right?
Yeah.
That's the message. It's like they're saying heinous shit that's wrong in this way that's like, look at us, woo! I mean, it's very American of them.
Yeah. Yeah. Very budding anti-racist. Like this is the kind of, right, like if anti-racism work falls into this diversity and inclusion, like neoliberal paradigm of progress, progress is a long ways away.
Yeah, for real.
I'm done.
All right. Well, we'll wrap up there. We'll be really curious to hear your takes on Hamilton. Kim, I don't know if you're watching this. Kim really loved Hamilton and picked up the biography too, or got it for Christmas. So, we'll be very curious about what your takes are. So share them with us in the comments.
Yeah.
And thanks for bearing with us. And, if you want to watch it,
it's on Disney Plus.
Bring some snacks.
Yeah, I suppose that too.
All right. Bye, y'all.
Bye.